The intelligence reports told an incredible story. By late 1944, something nobody expected was happening on Pacific battlefields. Japanese soldiers were starting to surrender. Not in huge numbers, but enough to shock military commanders on both sides. These weren't broken men giving up in despair. These were calculated choices. Wounded soldiers who could have fought to the death were laying down their weapons instead. What changed their minds? The answer lay in whispered conversations between units. Stories were spreading about American prison camps that sounded too good to be true. Let me take you back to where this all started. December 7th, 1941, wasn't just Pearl Harbor. It was the beginning of a clash between two completely different ways of thinking about war and human dignity. The Japanese military machine was built on Bushido, the ancient way of the warrior. Death was better than the shame of capture. Surrender meant disgrace to your family and your emperor. American forces followed different rules. The Geneva Convention said prisoners must be treated humanely. But there was something more at work here, something uniquely American that would shock Japanese soldiers to their core. Picture this scene. A young Japanese soldier, barely 20 years old, sits in stunned silence. An American medic carefully bandages a wound on his arm. Around him, other prisoners are getting hot meals and clean uniforms. Many had never received such good treatment, even in their own army. This wasn't what Sergeant Yamamoto expected when his unit trained for war in 1943. "I thought I was going to die," he told Allied questioners later. "Instead, they gave me more food in one day than I had eaten in a week back home." Between 35,000 and 50,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered to Allied forces before August 1945. But numbers don't tell the whole story. What they don't show is the amazing psychological journey these men went through. From warriors trained to die before surrender, to human beings discovering what it meant to be treated with dignity. The first Japanese prisoners were often shocked into silence, not by brutality. They were ready for that. They were stunned by kindness. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison kept detailed records of early prisoner questioning. His notes from 1942 paint a picture of profound cultural shock. "The prisoners seemed genuinely confused by our treatment," he wrote. "They expected execution or torture. When offered cigarettes and hot coffee, many refused. They thought it was psychological warfare. But it wasn't warfare at all. It was policy." While Japanese commanders told their forces that capture meant unspeakable horrors, American military doctrine was different. A healthy prisoner was more likely to give useful information. A well-fed prisoner might survive to prove that America honored its international promises. More importantly, treating prisoners humanely was simply who Americans believed themselves to be. The contrast couldn't have been starker. More than 140,000 Allied prisoners were held in Japanese camps. 1 in 3 died from starvation, overwork, punishment, or disease. Meanwhile, Japanese prisoners in American hands were discovering something impossible. Their captors cared more about their well-being than their own commanders ever had. Take Kishi Nakamura. He'd been fighting in the Solomon Islands for 8 months when shrapnel left him unable to walk. His own officers wrote him off as dead weight. In the brutal math of the Pacific War, wounded soldiers who couldn't fight were often abandoned, or worse. But when American Marines found him in a makeshift field hospital, everything changed. "They carried me," he told a war crimes investigator later. "Enemy soldiers, Americans. They carried me to their medical station. A doctor looked at my leg. Not their doctor first. Not treating their wounded first. He looked at me. This wasn't rare. American field medics had standing orders. Treat wounded prisoners with the same priority as your own wounded. It seemed impossibly generous to soldiers taught that enemies were subhuman, that mercy was weakness, that their own lives only had value serving the emperor. The food was another complete revelation. American military rations contained more protein and calories than most Japanese soldiers had seen in months. The home islands struggled with rice shortages. The military survived on tiny portions. Captured Japanese soldiers found themselves eating meals with meat, vegetables, bread, and even treats like chocolate or coffee. "I thought it was a trick," remembered Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka. His submarine was sunk near Midway. "The food was too good. I was suspicious they were trying to poison us. But then I saw the American soldiers eating the same food. I realized this was just how they lived." American POW camps were something special, even by Allied standards. The typical facility was worlds away from the bamboo cages and starvation rations of Japanese prison camps. Prisoners lived in wooden barracks with real beds, blankets, and heating. They had recreational facilities, educational programs, and even musical instruments. Some camps had libraries, sports equipment, and workshops where prisoners learned new skills. But perhaps most shocking was the medical care. American military doctors didn't just treat serious injuries. They provided routine health care, dental work, and even psychological support. Many Japanese prisoners got better medical attention as POWs than they'd ever received as active soldiers in their own army. The psychological impact was profound. These men had been raised to expect suffering as proof of virtue. Suddenly they found themselves somewhere their comfort and well-being genuinely mattered to their captors. American intelligence officers discovered that well-treated prisoners were incredibly cooperative. Not because they were broken or brainwashed, because they were being treated as human beings rather than expendable resources for perhaps the first time in their adult lives. The prisoners appreciated the Americans, one report noted. They felt the food, clothing, and medical treatment meant they owed favors to their captors. This created an unexpected dynamic. Former enemies began seeing their American guards not as conquerors, but as liberators from a system that viewed them as disposable. The intelligence gathered from cooperative prisoners proved invaluable. Details about Japanese military installations, troop movements, and strategic plans flowed freely. These were men who'd been shown there was another way to wage war, one that preserved human dignity even in mortal conflict. A typical day for a Japanese POW in an American facility began at 6:30 a.m., not with brutal punishment exercises or forced labor, with a hot breakfast. Meals included items many prisoners had never tasted: fresh milk, eggs, bacon, and fruit. Even under wartime rationing, American camps maintained nutritional standards that exceeded what most Japanese civilians got back home. Work assignments were voluntary and often educational. Prisoners could learn English, study American farming techniques, or work in camp libraries and workshops. Some became skilled in carpentry, mechanics, or other trades that would serve them after the war. The contrast with Japanese labor practices was dramatic. Allied prisoners were worked to death in mines and factories. Recreational activities were another source of amazement. Prisoners organized baseball teams, learned American games, and put on theatrical performances. Some camps had movie nights where prisoners watched American films, often their first exposure to Hollywood entertainment and American popular culture. Nothing captures the transformation better than the letters these prisoners were allowed to write home. Under international law, POWs had the right to write to relatives, but Japanese prisoners had been told enemy captors would never honor such niceties. Instead, they found themselves encouraged to write home. American censors checked letters not for secrets to suppress, but to make sure the mail system worked properly. One letter intercepted by Japanese intelligence in 1943 read, "Mother, I am well fed and healthy. The Americans treat us with more kindness than I have known since leaving home. I sleep in a real bed with clean sheets. Yesterday a guard brought me medicine when I had a cold. I do not understand this war anymore." What was happening went far deeper than physical comfort. Men taught that individual life was worthless were discovering their own worth as human beings. Guards who bothered to learn their names, doctors who cared about their health, administrators who worried about their families. This was a complete reversal of everything they'd been taught about warfare and human nature. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Some prisoners remained suspicious. They were convinced kindness was just sophisticated torture. Others struggled with the shame of surrender, regardless of treatment. But for many, being valued as individuals rather than expendable war tools was genuinely life-changing. To truly understand why Japanese prisoners called American camps paradise, we need to see what they'd left behind. The Japan of 1943 and 1944 was a nation consuming itself in total war. While Japanese POWs in American camps ate 3 full meals daily, their families survived on rationed rice mixed with sawdust and tree bark. The average Japanese civilian consumed fewer than 200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. Children showed signs of malnutrition. The elderly quietly starved in their homes. It wasn't just about food. The Japan these soldiers left was a society where individual needs were completely sacrificed to the war effort. Homes were cold because fuel was reserved for military use. Medical supplies were so scarce that even seriously wounded soldiers often got nothing more than a bandage. Major Kenji Watanabe, captured at Saipan in 1944, would later describe his revelation. "In America's prison camp, I had my own bed, my own blanket, clean clothes every week. I realized that in 2 years of military service, I had never owned anything. Everything belonged to the emperor, the army, the war. But in this American camp, they gave me things that were mine." This sense of individual worth was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect. Japanese military culture had systematically stripped away personal identity. Soldiers weren't individuals. They were interchangeable parts in the imperial war machine. Their names mattered less than their unit numbers. Letters from American camps began painting a picture that Japanese censors found disturbing. Prisoners wrote about dental care. Actual dentists who fixed their teeth not for military purposes, but simply because tooth pain was unpleasant. They described guards who asked about their families, who shared photographs of their own wives and children, who treated former enemies as human beings capable of homesickness and loneliness. An intercepted letter from 1944 particularly alarmed Japanese intelligence. "Dear Father, today an American doctor examined my eyes and gave me glasses. I can see clearly for the first time in years. He said no man should have to live with poor vision. I have been thinking about what this means, that they care about the sight of a prisoner who may never fight again. What kind of people are these Americans?" As 1943 turned into 1944 and more Japanese prisoners entered American custody, a pattern emerged. This wasn't just isolated good treatment. This was systematic policy. Word began to spread through whispered conversations of soldiers who'd survived battles and witnessed captures. Some Japanese units showed subtle but noticeable changes in their willingness to fight to the death. If capture meant torture and execution, dying in battle made sense. But if capture meant medical care, adequate food, and humane treatment, the implications were staggering. For Americans, basic human decency proved more effective than brutality. This challenged traditional military psychology. For Japanese commanders, troops who might choose surrender over death threatened the very foundations of their military culture. American field commanders reported a new phenomenon: Japanese soldiers who'd fight fiercely until wounded, then stop resisting once they could no longer fight effectively. Some even made subtle signals they were ready to be taken prisoner, behaviors that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Captain Robert Chen, a Japanese-American intelligence officer, noted, "These prisoners aren't broken men. They're men who discovered that survival with honor is possible. They speak freely because they trust us to keep our word about treatment. That trust is our most valuable intelligence asset." When the war ended in August 1945, American authorities faced repatriating thousands of Japanese prisoners who'd spent months discovering what democracy and individual dignity looked like. Many became informal ambassadors for American values in a Japan struggling to reinvent itself under occupation. Hiroshi Nakajima, repatriated in 1946, kept a detailed diary of his readjustment. "Everything here seems smaller, darker, more constrained. In the American camp, we had space to think, question, grow as individuals." The story of Japanese prisoners in American camps reveals fundamental truths about human nature. These men discovered they had inherent worth as individuals, not just as servants of the state. They learned that former enemies could show genuine compassion. They experienced being valued for their humanity rather than their usefulness to a war machine. The American approach proved treating prisoners humanely wasn't just morally correct. It was strategically effective. Well-fed, well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence and caused fewer security problems. The Japanese soldiers who called American prison camps paradise weren't just comparing physical conditions. They were recognizing the revolutionary idea that every human being has inherent worth. In a war defined by unprecedented brutality, these camps stood as beacons of what humanity could aspire to be. They proved maintaining moral principles in wartime wasn't weakness, it was strength. The paradise these prisoners discovered wasn't a place. It was a principle. The principle that every human being deserves basic dignity and respect. In recognizing this truth, both captors and captives found something more valuable than military victory. They found a path toward a more humane future.